Welcome to the grants presentation and the very first webinar from Uplift. We're so glad to have you here today. I'm going to plow through a lot of information, and I'm going to ask everyone to put their comments in the chat. Put your questions in the chat, put your comments in the chat. Next slide, please. Fantastic. Just a quick overview of what we'll be covering. I want to first have a chat-based discussion about how people find grants. Then we're going to move quickly into a wide variety of grant resources that we have found. And this is only a fraction of the ones that we have on our knowledge base. The knowledge base is going to be launching in early July, so please stay tuned for that. We're going to talk briefly about applying for grants and best practices, managing grants. We will wrap up at the end and then do a non-recorded Q&A session. Okay, discussion on finding grants. I would love for everyone to put into the chat how they currently find grants right now. Please just pop it into the grants. How do you come across grants that you might want to apply for? Okay. Referral, absolutely. Word of mouth is absolutely one of the best ways to find out about grants. We hope that Uplift can be a referral organization for you. Yes, I'm so excited that people are here to learn about how to apply for grants. Emails, yeah, I mean, I am on a whole bunch of different email lists. Not that I can have time to read all of the email lists, right, that come through, but you can scan an email and just pick up on some key phrases and find grants, a lot of grants that way. By signing up for email lists. Partners, absolutely. The more partnerships you have, the more that people know the types of work that you are interested in and the types of needs that you have, the better the referrals are going to be. Oh, yes, and absolutely, there's so many different service providers. The Department of Commerce was named within the chat just now. So many different service providers, state agencies, COGS, Council of Governments, other nonprofit organizations. So many people are invested in the rural success of North Carolina, and individuals that work at those agencies are always on the lookout for different grants that might be beneficial to rural communities. Town, county, and state administrators, absolutely. Some of the best ways to find grants and people who are always looking for grants to then pass them along. Also, just doing an online Google search, right? That was brought up in the chat as well. Are there other ways of finding grants other than the ones that have been mentioned? It sounds like there's a lot of referrals going on, and maybe some searching. Are there other ways to find grants? Well, certainly, I can also, what I tend to do is if I'm looking for a particular grant in a sector, like say agritourism or agriculture, I might already know about certain agencies to look for. So I can go directly to their site. You can do searches on North Carolina Grants Arts, or Southeast United States Parks. So knowing the right terms certainly do help. But then there are websites that are dedicated just to grants. I'm wondering, and this is more of a rhetorical question, but I'm wondering if anyone on the call has ever used the grants.gov portal for federal grants. If you have, then God bless you, because that is just such a cumbersome and scary and intimidating website. But again, a different way to find grants. One of my very favorite personal ways is what you all have already said, the networking with partners, having referrals, being plugged into networks of service providers, and being on listservs. I will use this as a plug to say, I'm so glad that you are on this call and that you heard about this grants workshop. But if you are not already signed up for the Uplift newsletter that we send out every month, that is also going to have a lot of grant blurbs and grant opportunities on it. Okay. What I'd like to do now is go through a whole array of different types of grants that we have found. Now, some of these, some of you on the call who are very seasoned grant writers, this may not be new to you, but please know that this is a sample of some of the grants that we have in our database. We have categorized these by different sectors of the community, if you will. And again, it represents some of the needs that we have heard from our Uplift community. So let's go to the next slide. A lot of times we will hear from communities about the green space, the open space, but sometimes this land needs to be needs to have a little bit of development added to it, whether it's a greenway or fencing for a dog park, trash cans, seating, just basic infrastructure for human use. And there are certainly a lot of funds out there to assist with the acquisition of land, the purchase of land, as well as some of this basic infrastructure. It's unfortunate that this isn't more of an interactive type of discussion, but we will have time at the end for me to hear from you as to whether any of you have applied for any of these grants and successfully received them. Having that track record of having gotten a grant, no matter how small, is a step in the process of receiving more grants. If we could go to, well, before we go to the next slide, look at the last one. Look at that last one, pollinator habitats. Yes, please bring in the pollinators. So I point that out just because we do try to look at for some of the more cutting edge and trending types of grant opportunities, as well as some of the traditional ones, like the Parks and Recreation Trust Fund, which has been around for over 50 years. Next slide, please. Okay, more parks and trails. We love our parks and trails, and we love our parks and trail partners. All of these grants represent organizations that not only offer money, but many of them offer technical assistance. So as you get to know Uplift, as we get to know you, we will all be able to network. You have partners, we have partners, and we will be able to match needs with resources, whether that's funding or technical assistance. I love the therapeutic garden grant. I didn't know about that one. That is something, obviously, one of these three other clever Uplift people found. I love that. And note that dollar value, $1,000 to $3,000. I love the small grants. I mean, people, obviously it'd be nice to receive $500,000, right? Nobody's going to turn that down, but with the increased dollar amounts, so is the increased burden of management, reporting, communications, and obviously the job that is going to be done. If you are a new time grant seeker, I really highly encourage you to look at some of these smaller grants because they're going to be easier to write. You're going to feel more confident as you receive these grants, as you write these grants, as you receive these grants, as you interact with the grantors, and as you manage the grant. So I am a huge, huge fan of the $1,000 to $3,000, $1,000 to $5,000 range. Love the therapeutic garden grant. Next, please. As much as I love parks and trails, I might like arts and cultural grants even more. Cartwheels teaching artist, what? Some of these grants have the best names. And when you first look at them, you might think, that doesn't apply to me. Maybe it doesn't apply to you specifically or your organization, but I bet it could apply to someone in your community. I'm a sucker for public art, and having the mural grant, the 2023 mural grant, just sounds so interesting. Kathy, we are so excited to have Kathy, even though she has a really ridiculously long title. We're going to try to shorten that. We are so excited to have Kathy here because you might look at something and go, I don't understand what the 2023 Community Mural Grant is, and you can hop on a call with Kathy and you and others in your community, and you can work through whether the scope of the grant is right for your community. Let's go to the next, please. Farming and food systems. One of the things I love about tourism is that it spans a lot of different pieces of the community. And some of our very first meetings we had with the Uplift communities, we were asked whether food systems, food security, food hubs, whether that was within the purview of our mission. And while tourists themselves obviously eat, food insecurity might not be a direct link to tourism. However, I always say that before a community can be a community where tourists want to come visit, it's got to be a great community for people to live. And so food security, in my mind, food systems is absolutely related to building a sustainable community, and therefore, which is the first step in building a sustainable destination. And we're looking all the time for not only for grants that apply to the general public, but also to specific groups within a community. So, for example, the Farmers of Color Network Infrastructure Grant, up to $10,000. Again, that falls within that beautiful, sweet, smaller type of grant award, and one that I would very much encourage people to look for when they are first starting out on the grants seeking track. Next slide, please. I love it. So I'm just blown away at some of these grants. The Fruit Tree Planting Foundation. This is so interesting to me. And there's a term under this, in kind, that certainly is going to bring up a lot of discussion, I hope, at the end. Many times, as you may well know, grants require matching funds, and it doesn't always come up as 50-50, 50% the community puts in 50% of the dollar amount needed, and the grant awards 50% of the dollar amount needed. Sometimes it's 20-80 or 80-20. But also in some cases, the match from the community can be in kind. So a non-dollar match. It could be in the time awarded by someone's, it could be the time that someone is spending towards a particular project. Their salary can be counted as a match. It would be in kind. So I just bring that up so as a topic we could discuss at the end as well. Next slide. Another category we've had a lot of requests for are museums, community museums, small museums, heritage museums. And one I was so excited to find myself, patting myself on the back, was the Inspire grants for small museums, which $5,000 to $50,000 does not sound like a small amount of money for a small museum. Of course, $50,000, if you're talking about exhibits, will, be spent very quickly. But still, this is a nice chunk of change for a small boost for a small museum. Again, we are just going through, I'm not going to talk in any depth about each one of these grants. You would, fall asleep. But this is just meant to give you an overview of the types of grants that we have found and are continuing to find to put into our grants database in the Knowledge Center on the Uplift site. We could go to the next slide, please. Fantastic. What do I want to talk about here? The Costume Society of America. I have no idea what that is, but it sounds super interesting and perhaps very relevant to someone on this call. Next slide, please. Community development and resilience. A lot of the ones on this slide you may be well familiar with. USDA Rural Development. We have a lovely call with them coming up tomorrow to learn more about their loans and grants programs. Golden Leaf obviously has been a very strong partner in rural communities for many, many years. The Duke Energy Foundation. Again, these are just a few of the ones, just a sample of what we have. So I'm really excited about seeing some of the comments in the chat that are offering up other suggestions for us to put into our knowledge base. Thank you. Next slide, please. Fantastic. The National Trust for Preservation, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, they have so many different avenues of grants. You all who are on the call and may be familiar with the Main Street program, this is a program that has originated out of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Even though I've been a big fan of Main Street and aware of Main Street for a very long time, I was not aware of all of the different types of efforts that the National Trust does beyond Main Street and the types of grants that they have available. So, our grants program will be looking at these traditional forms of grants, as well as some of, look at the first one on this list, ones from the cooperatives, the electricity and power cooperatives and companies that we have in North Carolina, but also the Southeast. If you remember, Duke was on a previous slide. Next, please. Fantastic. There is not a community in North Carolina, a rural community, that is not interested in internet and broadband. And we have been able to find a few grant resources that apply to this need. I am absolutely not very well versed in this particular category. But if anyone on the Uplift team, if we run into a category where anyone on the Uplift team is not well versed in it, please know that we will find the right providers to come in and do a workshop on these particular types of grants. So our job is to seek additional resources that all of us collectively don't have. Next slide, please. Fantastic. One of the things that is built into the Uplift program and that we hear over and over again is small business. And the tourism industry especially is made up of a lot of mom and pop businesses, a lot of franchise businesses, and then of course, properties that belong to larger businesses. The first two categories of businesses that I mentioned are typically eligible for these types of grants. Some of them are, again, going to be focused on particular groups within the community. It might be BIPOC-owned businesses or women-owned businesses or veteran-owned businesses. But in general, we're going to have a lot of grant opportunities and loan opportunities for small businesses, particularly as it relates to COVID relief. Youth development. Oh my gosh, we have so many fantastic organizations in North Carolina dedicated to youth development. The Rural Center, the Resourceful Communities Program out of the Conservation Fund, North Carolina Cooperative Extension. I'm just naming a few. I want to stop there because I will get in trouble for leaving out some, major organizations. One of the best sources of grants for youth development we found on the Resourceful Communities Program of the Conservation Fund, because it is not a new thing to collect and create databases of grant resources. Some of the grants that we're finding are individual sources, but some of them are collections of already put together lists. And so we're so happy that for the last decade in North Carolina and possibly more, there's been a big emphasis on how can we create a pipeline, how can we empower our youth, how can we invest in the young leadership of tomorrow. And so we are especially excited to work with any Uplift communities towards this end. Please, please, please let us know about your needs and desires in this category. Placemaking, one of my favorite words. Kofi Boone, who is on the leadership team of Uplift, he has also taught me to say not only placemaking, but placekeeping, because a lot of places already are fabulous, right? And we just need to keep them that way. One of my favorite organizations that talks about placemaking and placekeeping, they don't give grants, but again, we're also, you can't separate grants from technical assistance. And one of my favorite placemaking and placekeeping organizations is PPS, the Project for Public Spaces. This is Will, if you don't mind looking up pps.org, plop that in the chat for people to click on, because you really do need to sign up for their newsletter to get lots of ideas about how to do placemaking and placekeeping in your community. If you're not familiar with those terms, it's exactly what it sounds like. All of the beautiful parts of a community, the people, the nature, the culture, the public spaces where people gather and decide to do things to better their community. All of that is part of placemaking and placekeeping. So you'll continue to hear those terms the more you're engaged in Uplift. Oh my gosh, we have gotten so many requests for information about signage, wayfinding signage, historic site signage, tourist organizational directional signage, the old TODS program of North Carolina. And so, whereas these awards are typically not a particular amount, they are important to flag here, so that perhaps one of you in this call and beyond might be able to acquire some funding for 1, 2, or 10 signs for your community. Certainly Health and Human Services ties in with the parks, recreation, wellness, as well as youth development, and as well as food security. There's just no part of a community that can be isolated, that's not integrated into the other. So we wanted to make sure that we provide information to address some of the health and human service needs within the rural communities in our service area. Okay, all right. So that concludes the whirlwind tour of some of the grant opportunities that we have found for you. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be launching the Knowledge Center on the Uplift website. One piece of the Knowledge Center will be a database of grants, a growing database of loans, as well as market trends, all of the video recordings from our webinars, regional blueprints, a variety of resources will be on this Knowledge Center. So please don't feel like this is the last time you're going to hear from us about grants. This is only the first grants workshop we're having. And we've got such a wonderful person now in charge of all of the information that's going to be coming to you. I want to take a minute to talk about grants management. We get so excited once we get that notice, once we get that letter and that email that we have X amount of dollars. And it is an exciting thing. And you need to pop a bottle of champagne and toast to your success, because it is difficult to get a grant. It can be non-alcoholic champagne. I'm just saying I prefer the kind with alcohol in it. Maybe that is not relevant here, but I just thought I would share. You do need to celebrate however it is you celebrate. But then after the celebration is over, it is time to get to work. It's time to get to work to read the specific agreement, to read the specific particulars about what is expected of you, not only to fulfill the project itself, the wonderful project that you outlined and you explained so well why it's going to benefit your community, but now it's time to get to work on the monitoring, on the evaluation, on the reporting, on the financial management of things. I'm going to, for the next 2 to 3 slides, just talk about some best practices. And these best practices, a lot of them come from a presentation that County Manager Eric Evans in Edgecombe County presented last year. I learned these from him. I am certainly not the expert, but I have won some grant awards and can speak from my experience as well. Ideally, you want to have a team. It's so exciting, again, to find out that you won an award, but that excitement is quickly replaced with, oh my goodness, I'm the dog chasing the car and I've caught the car, and now what do I do with this car? It can be a feeling of being overwhelmed, maybe a little bit of regret. But I say this just to say that's normal. That's a normal feeling, a little bit of, oh my gosh, what do I do now? Ideally, you're not going to be doing it alone. And when I say have a team, it might be one other person. And I know that in rural communities, you already wear 17 hats. I'm not talking about a full-time grants manager, nor am I talking about a full-time grants writer, but each of us do different pieces of our job. And it certainly would be nice to have 1 or 2 or 3 other people to have a piece of their job to collaborate with you on this grant, the fulfillment of this grant. Now, you'll see on the slide, the very first bullet says grant writer, and there's an asterisk beside that. Part of the team could be the grants writer. However, as nice and attractive it is to think of hiring someone to write a grant, unless that person is in your community or they are familiar with your particular situation or with rural communities in general, I really want to ask you to think twice about hiring a grants writer to write a grant that you may very well get, but it might end up being not what you actually needed. And now here you are having to fulfill a grant promise that has been awarded to you, but it wasn't really written the way you wanted, or it's not exactly fulfilling a need in your community. I would just, if you can, work with other service providers, work with us, work with other technical assistance providers, work with the grant referring agency itself to write the grant. So many times we're intimidated by the grant awarding organization, or at least I'll just speak for myself. I was, until I understood that everybody is on your side. Everybody is on our side. They want us to do well. They want to read good grant applications. And they want an informed constituency. So grant writers are good. I'm not putting them all down, but I'm just warning of the thought that having a grant writer just to write a grant and money starts flowing in, it could actually bring you more problems than you may anticipate. Reporting, compliance, financial management, all of that is something that is not very much fun. However, the sooner you put into place systems, even if you start thinking ahead of time before you're even awarded the grant, how would I track the finances? Who is going to track the finances? Are we going to use a spreadsheet? Are we going to use QuickBooks? Is there a separate system from our normal budgeting and finance tools that we're going to use? How are we going to evaluate? How are we going to evaluate the success of this grant? Now, sometimes grant applications ask for your evaluation plan, but typically you don't have to write a lot. You just kind of give a broad swath, a broad idea of how you might evaluate the success of the project. But now you've received the grant and you really need to think about how you're going to evaluate the success. And that's a whole different animal. Again, having a team in place so that you're not doing it alone, just to have different ideas would certainly be of benefit. We have ideas. We have thoughts about perhaps trying to get AmeriCorps volunteers to come work in your community. The more people, the merrier. Some of those volunteers, AmeriCorps representatives, some of them could be assigned to particular projects and grant awards. So thinking about these systems, even down to, how often is the team going to meet? How often am I, the person in charge of this project or the person in charge of this grant, how often am I going to sit down and have reflection time? Something like that is, I don't think you can put too much time into that. In fact, I think we probably might all err towards not putting enough time into that. And then, of course, the implementation. To think that one or two people can write the grant, manage the grant, evaluate the grant, and also implement the grant Well, that's an invitation for burnout. And I say that because there's if you look at the very last bullet on the slide, it says it's okay to wait and it's okay not to apply. Part of getting a successful grant and managing a successful project is not going for it until you're ready. And so making sure you are absolutely ready is one of the wisest things that you can do. Again, I invite people who are here on the call, please continue to put lots and lots of questions and thoughts and critiques and your own experiences into the chat as you hear me blah, 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 because we're going to have a discussion after the recording is stopped. And I can't wait for that. What happens if the grant is poorly managed? Well, some of the worst case outcomes is, what you want to have happen doesn't happen. Now it's a public failure. You've lost some trust, not only from the grantor, but from some of your partners and from of your constituents. You have spent money. Your organization has spent money, and now you're accountable to say what you have done for it. Sometimes that may put a financial burden on your organization if you don't fulfill the responsibilities of the agreement and of the grant. And certainly a failed grant attempt, especially if it's a publicly failed project, will damage future opportunities. It is okay to wait and not apply if you don't think you're quite ready yet. So some things, again, you need to have is a very strong understanding of the grant. If you are a person that hates to read, you're probably not the right person to apply for a grant. It is a lot of tedious reading, not only the grant, not only the call for the grants, not only the announcement for the grants, but on the back end, the award, the requirements for the grant, the reporting and the compliance requirements. Again, you're going to have to read. It's very, very beneficial to have a relationship with the funder. The time to start cultivating that relationship is not when the grant application comes out. Chances are, if you're on this call and you've been in community development and you've been in economic development for more than 10 years, you've got relationships. You've got relationships with some of the organizations that were listed earlier on this presentation, or you've got relationships with service providers within those sectors: parks and recreation, health and human services, farms and food systems, arts and cultural, broadband, internet. You've got some relationships. I do encourage you, if you're going to stay in community and economic development, to continue to cultivate those relationships, because they can only help you do your job better and then eventually secure a very authentic, sincere relationship with funders. Thinking about the financial management structure prior to applying for the grant, again, absolutely a best practice. And being able to articulate your purpose and your goals and the impact that it will have on your community in a strong and heartfelt, meaningful way is going to go a long way towards a successful grant application. Next slide, please. Some best practices. Again, reading. Do I want to read the Code of Federal Regulations? Absolutely not. And so what is going to make me read it? Well, what's going to make me read it is me saying, hey, Kathy, let's have an appointment next week. Let's meet for an hour and let's read through the Code of Federal Regulations together. We'll read it page by page. We'll stop. We'll make sure we have an understanding of each section. We'll talk about it. Is this how you interpreted that? No, that's not. I thought it was like this. So in order to make things a little less painful, it's always good to have that colleague there. Any sort of funding authority, grant proposal guidelines, it's dry stuff. So I encourage you not to try to bull your way through it by yourself. Your mind's going to go blank. You're going to glaze over. But do it with a pal, and try to make it a collaborative process. In discussing anything, you're going to learn it better, and you're only going to be able to manage that grant better. In terms of writing the grant application itself, 2 questions, that are always part of best practices. Have you addressed everything the funder asked about? It's not going to get by the funder if you skip a section or if you skip a question. And so make sure you're hitting every single piece on the application. And if there's a piece that you're not sure about, don't guess. Ask the funder directly what this means. Would these be good examples of that? Sometimes it's just a misunderstanding. You've been thinking about a certain way, and a 10-minute conversation can clarify that. I also encourage you to let the funder know directly. You hear them, you understand that the grant application is for X, Y, and Z, and this is how you are addressing X, Y, and Z in your community. If you say it back to them that you are actually doing P, Q, and T, they may not understand that you understand that the grant is to support X, Y, and Z. So do think about saying it back to them in their own words, but in such a way that you're saying, I understand what you want, and this is how we're addressing X, Y, and Z in our community. Make sure your concept for the grant aligns with their direct ask from you. And then the last thing on this slide that I love to address, because I say this all the time in life to my colleagues, to my students. Hessa has heard me say these so many times. But the best way to edit something, is to read it out loud. Because if you read it in your head, if you read it silently, your brain fills in the mistakes. Your brain just reads right over it. And so if you read it out loud, it forces you to do every single word. And mind you, your brain is going to always trick you and say, wait, no, great. Thank you for reading a little bit out loud. You can go back to reading it in your head now. No, read the whole thing out loud, and you will catch so many different mistakes. Another way of doing that is, again, I call Kathy and I'm like, hey, Kathy, let's read through this, make sure it sounds like the way we want it, because I'm going to glaze over if I'm just doing it by myself, but it holds me accountable to have another person in the room. All right, Kathy, would you please read that first section? I listened to her, and okay, that sentence, let's reword that. Let's make sure, and then I'll take a turn, I'll read it. And together we will wordsmith it. That is surefire the best way to edit anything. You can also, if you're just adamant about not reading it out loud, shame on you. But if you're adamant about that, you can pass it around to friends, just have multiple eyes on it, get different points of view, because you're so ingrained in it. You think it's absolutely clear. But would someone off the street who has never heard of economic and community development, would they be able to pick it up and think about it? I always think, would my 90-year-old mom understand what I'm trying to explain here? And if the answer is no, then I need to go back, maybe shorten for clarification or elaborate for clarification to make sure my 90-year-old mom, well, she's 91, will understand the concept. And then a kind of interesting way, I will say, to edit something, if I've got like a 5-page report or a research paper that I've written, I've read it 35 times, so I'm just going to glass over it. What I do is I start in the very last paragraph and I read it first. Now I'm reading it out of context. Does that make sense? And then I'll read the paragraph before that. And then the paragraph before that, not section by section, but literally paragraph by paragraph. And if you do that, your brain is turned on a little bit more and is paying a little bit more attention to what's coming out. Next slide, please. Okay. Last slide on best practices. And then we're going to get to some good, juicy discussion. Relationships cannot be over emphasized in this scenario. You know, I mentioned earlier, if you have been in community and economic development for over 10 years, you already have a lot of relationships. Your relationships are gold. You know that. I could go on and on and on about that. But in terms of implementing finding a grant, getting a grant, implementing a grant, and then documenting and reporting on a grant, your relationships are absolutely key, because you're not going to be doing this by yourself. If you are new to the grant scene, and there's one thing I want you to take away from this, if nothing else, start small. A $1,000 grant is so much fun to write, to get, to implement, to celebrate. You know, that needs to go on the best practices slide, y'all. We have got to put celebrate, because that is one thing I learned from Handmade in America, my years working with Becky Anderson. When a community gets a $1,000 grant and you put that grant into practice and you put out 5 park benches around your courthouse, or you're able to beautify the downtown with some new plantings, you flip and celebrate, because that's amazing. And people did that together, and that's what you're celebrating. It gets people excited, and it gets people vested in doing more. So start small, build up. But even before you get that $1,000 grant, I even would encourage you to give people a sample of what you can do. And what I mean by that is, if there's something that you can do in kind, pro bono, that can show your track record, even without money, if you can show that and demonstrate that, tell the grantor what you've been doing in the community without money. Just think of what I could do with $5,000. And one of the things that's not on this best practices slide, but we will be addressing this in future grants workshop, is the ability to tell your story. Grantors want numbers, sure. They want to know how many jobs, they want to know how many businesses, they want to know that. Absolutely. But being able to craft your impact in a story, a meaningful narrative of how you have touched lives, that's going to also go a long way. And we're going to be talking about that I have a favorite way of doing that through a community capitals model that we can talk about in future sessions. But I will end with the adage that there is no such thing as over communication, and there is certainly, in the world of grants, no such thing as over documentation. It is worth every minute that you use to document meetings, to document who was there, to document what came out of the meeting, to document any type of impact, volunteer hours, in-kind hours. Yeah, just document. Not only when it comes to what's happening in the community, but communication between you and the grantor, communication between you and your partners. Make sure you keep records of those things, because if you're like me, you're going to forget. You might remember sort of a big picture, but you might forget the specifics of who's going to do what when. And so if you keep those records, it's not only about holding people accountable, it's just about holding your memory accountable and making sure everybody's on the same page when it comes to fulfilling the grant in a very, very successful manner. I love to create joint work sessions for tasks that I hate doing. And the older I get, the more I do this. And, bless the people's hearts that have to work with me all the time. Shout out to Hessa. We meet to hold ourselves accountable for doing the tasks that need to be done because they're so easy to slough off. But it's part of the work, and we make those sessions so that we just sit down and we do them and we document them and we know that they're done. I also think it's important to communicate about obvious things, even though I could make the assumption that Kathy is going to, advance the slides tonight and Will is going to monitor the chat and, Hessa is going to press the recording. I can assume all that and it probably is going to happen, but we over communicated about it before you all came into the chat, and we had emails about it earlier in that, who's going to do what. Kathy had some clarifying questions. Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Please communicate about obvious things just to make sure everybody is on the same page. That is a best practice when it comes to grant management. I will end there. I believe the next slide is just to acknowledge the fantastic Kathy Ruberg, who is our grants and loans manager. Thank you to Will Carswell for being here tonight. He has done so much work adding to the grants resource database. Hessa, of course, keeps us all running and all out of trouble. She is the glue of Uplift. If you have not subscribed to our email list just to get updates on webinars and meetings and other opportunities, please scan this barcode and in your leisure time, subscribe to our email list.